Hey folks, it's 6:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, August the 4th in the year that we're told, 2023. It's been a little while since I've made a briefs or much of anything. And I have to start by actually telling you a little bit about why that is and just what's on the horizon. Now, I don't go into that sort of thing heavily at this point in my monthly mailers, but I do actually cover what projects I'm working on and at what stages. So if you want to get those, just send me an email at john@oberyproject.info. The link is always in the description. And just put in the subject line, add me. And I'll add you, and I'll send you that once a month on the first of the month, and you can read that through, you can skim it, you can toss it, you can do whatever you want with it, because once I send it, it's yours. All rights reserved. Anyways, it's been a while since I've produced anything for any of the almost free platforms. Like YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey. Odyssey, I don't even care about. Odyssey I don't know what it is about Odyssey. But listen, I'm 48. So I remember back when there were video stores. And all the video stores, well, not all of them, but most of them, they had a little porn room with like a curtain in front of the door and a big sign above it, said adults only and all that. Okay? And when you walked into the porn room, because I did a number of times, because they had video stores up until I was like, oh my gosh, you know what? Now that I think about it, the little town that me and my current wife, being my second wife, that we moved to a few years after we got married in southwestern Michigan, they had a laundromat with a video store. But in general, I mean, they still had video stores like into my 30s easily before they started phasing them out. Anyways, so, it was like this little room and it was kind of dimly lit, I guess, so that you didn't notice that it was your pastor that was over in the corner. And there was always like this weird smell, like that they had to like kill some sort of odor in there. And a weird vibe. Just this weird vibe feeling you couldn't really put your finger on. I mean, outside of the fact that you were now surrounded by all kinds of really in-your-face, sometimes grotesque images. That's the way I feel when I go to Odyssey. If that makes any sense. So, anyways, I'm not saying, like, I don't know. I've never seen any content like that at Odyssey. It gives me that vibe. And it's like a creepy vibe. And that's not to suggest YouTube's any less creepy. YouTube's super creepy. As is BitChute, they all have their own special ways of being slimy. For some reason, the Odyssey way is more repulsive. So here's the reason. I haven't run out of material. I haven't come close to running out of material. I don't have writer's block. I'm stuck, for one thing, on some very big projects. One of them being the study of air as mountain, which I began producing because I thought I could just do that in like about 3 segments. I began producing it as episode 14 of the Obery Hours. I entitled The Vertical Flip, episode 1. Here's the thing. I found out when I was working on basically phase 2 and 3 of that, I found out so much about the aspects of that root, ER, air, that helped me to go back and re-examine those obere cognates, which I had gone over in that first episode, and identify, maybe not at this point, maybe not perfectly, but in a very, very close way, all of those obere cognates, able to illustrate how they are all related to the word in question in the study, Strong's H2022 air, translated 400 to 500 times in the Old Testament as mountain, mount, hills, hill country, which really changed the ball game significantly. So, pretty quick here, that episode that I published, number 14, that's got to go. And I will republish another episode 1, number 14 in the Obere Hours, and then after that 2 and 3 to give you the complete study. And when I'm done, that study will also be published because it's a big old study. It's a very large document. I may just publish it in book form. It is a powerful study, not only in questioning whether or not this word actually means mountain, which goes far beyond questioning it. I disprove it. But it also demonstrates how we can use even what materials are available, which are pretty awful. And I mean references. So I use an Anglo-Saxon English dictionary, so like Old Anglo-Saxon, where they still used what they call like the Saxon T, which is the equivalent of like the Obere the, th sounding the, which also occurs in Gothic at almost the same point in the Gothic alphabet as Obere. The W, of course, is almost oddly T-looking in the Saxon, so there's these differences in look and some differences in sounds. Also a Gaelic English dictionary. Now this is Armstrong, and the reason I use Armstrong is because so many others who have written similar references use Armstrong as sort of their jumping off point. German English by Flugel, Latin English by J.E. Riddle. The Proto-Indo-Europeans are a mess as far as the references go. And I can't remember the guy who sort of wrote the biggest, most exhaustive work on it. But anyways, even those references, which I have to comb through because unfortunately everything's not as neatly alphabetical as I'd like. And vowels are an absolute mess. And repetition is really terrible. And, you know, the fact that oftentimes aspirants are added. So there might be an H somewhere where you expected a vowel to be. And, you know, if you're looking for words that might be cognates of an Obere word that started with N, you might have to check the G's for GN, you know, like gnaw. You might have to check the M's for MN. Because so much of this is, I'm going to give you the official explanation of progression. So many of these Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Germanic, and well, forget Proto-Indo-European for now. That's a foil. They're so heavily influenced by Latin. There's so much Latin infused in there. You're basically looking at like a mix of Obere and Latin and some Greek, which has all been phonetically sort of turned around a lot, which is what makes it so confusing and so messy. And the thing about Latin is, so you check the Latin references, and you'll see that so much of that is influenced by Greek And so and then you get into the territory of Proto-Indo-European, where they try to say that all these languages were essentially developed and sprang from India. Whereas the same could be true if we just, let's say we just presupposed that there was a population of people who originally spoke one language, and they were taken and put amongst populations of people who spoke another language. Let's say they were infused into populations who mostly spoke Latin and Latin dialects, or populations that spoke mostly what we call Greek and Greek dialects. And I'm not talking about in Greece, because those people don't like Greek. They keep changing it back to more Slavonic. That's what they normally speak. And if you've known plenty of Greeks from Greece, like fresh off the boat Greeks, or pretty close to fresh off the boat Greeks, first off, you'll know that they are typically a more dark Mediterranean people, and they typically speak a more Slavic sounding language. So I'm not talking about in Greece. I'm talking about the language called Greek. So it's a mess. Takes a while to get through. But if you start seeing the patterns and how influences, and the thing is, these guys that wrote these reference books, they're not our friends. They're not our friends. I mean, a lot of them are honest enough to say right at the beginning of the book, this is dedicated to his high exalted lord such and such, who, paid, commissioned, and all this. If these lords and dukes and kings and so on and so forth, and the state, because that's the state, the lords, the kings, the dukes, the aristocrats of old are the state of today. They just went into, basically, they went invisible around World War I and World War II. That's still the state. Then you know that there's a problem. This is the same thing with all of the history reference works that are considered by the establishment as history. And that's why they have to be approached with so much critical examination, critical thinking, and a lack of trust. And I found this out over a really long period of time. It just got to where I had to examine everything in a more basic system, in the sense of figuring out everything I could about Obery, using the language in the Bible as it appears in the Bible itself, along with comparing it to anything I could find in Anglo-Saxon, Gaelic, Germanic, Proto-Indo-European references, including Latin and Greek, because some of those words ended up in the official reference works of those languages. I'm not implying that any of those languages originally had those words in there. The problem is everything, all of those reference works, earliest, come from the 1800s, typically mid to late. So we have no way of proving that they weren't just thrown in there as transliterations. I mean, sometimes the Latin dictionary will admit that certain words were transliterated from Celtic. So, anyways, that's the thing. There's just been a lot going on. Academically, intellectually, just a lot going on. And it's a drain. It's like climbing 20 flights of stairs. It's an absolute drain. When you start out, you take the first couple of flights briskly, and then you realize you got a heck of a lot more flights to go, and you get into a rhythm that's daunting, but you think you can do it, and then a dozen flights in, and you're thinking these next 8 flights, if I make it, are definitely going to have a marked effect on me for at least the next few days. So I'm in those last flights. And it is daunting. It really is, mentally. So by the time I end up working on those things for a few hours in the morning, it's like I'm just drained. It's like I'm drained. The only thing I can think to do is stop thinking and actually just go and do physical work, especially in the morning on my garden. So there's one of the things that's actually taken away from the time I've had to make things. I put in a garden. a practical garden. My family eats a lot of the same basic things that I think a lot of typically just poor, common people eat. We eat a lot of sauces. As far as tomatoes go, we don't eat a lot of like slices of tomatoes on things or tomatoes in salads. Those are fine. No problem. But all of these crazy little, whatever they call them, the small tomatoes. Yeah, those aren't really any good for sauces. They're not all that great in salsas. I mean, you can have a different opinion, that's fine. And then, of course, the large ones, like your Jet Stars and Big Boys, like your beefsteak tomatoes, they're not really good for sauces either. They're kind of on a sandwich. And, that's only good for the summer. As far as the long term, you need something that's a good, hearty, saucing tomato. So I put in a dozen or so Roma tomato plants. And they've taken a lot of care because they don't grow very tall. They're determinates. They don't grow very tall, but when they start fruiting, the tomatoes can be so excessive on one plant. And you don't want them sitting on the ground, the tomatoes. So you gotta figure out ways to hold them up. Cages, that's just, I don't like the cages. So I had to set up a post and string system. And it just takes constant work. I have a small herb garden. Again, a lot of work. You gotta be snipping at it all the time once they start getting to a certain size. I put in russets and red potatoes because, of course, we're going to be able to use those and a lot of them. I make my own French fries and other things at home. Don't buy them from the store if I can help it. Put in onions, white and yellow, and this horrible grass that I wasn't as aware of in Indiana invaded my garden here in Michigan. It's called torpedo grass. I thought it was crabgrass at first, because of the way that it kind of grows in these really big, long shoots. And of course, those shoots, they just kind of like grow along the ground. And the problem is their roots grow underground in the same way, laterally. And the leaves, they just break right off. So you've got to get your whole hand and essentially dig around the plant, get all of the leaves together if you can, and then pinch underneath the surface of the soil as much as you can, and basically work that plant up as much as you can, because you don't want it to stay in there. You don't even want its roots to stay in there. And then by the time you get all of that out, it wants to take so much topsoil, valuable topsoil with it. It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. So these things got into my onion rows early, and I had a few things that were pressing, and it kind of caught me off guard. And I had to hand weed out all of these. Like my whole garden, I've hand weeded so much torpedo grass out of, it's not even funny. And I think it really hurt my tomato yield, because I mean, honestly, I should have like 60 or more onion plants coming up between the whites and the yellows. I've got like a dozen or so. That's about it that have come up, and I have to wonder what happened to the rest of those bulbs. I don't want to dig them up and find out. I'd rather, I know it's late, but now that I've weeded all of that up, I'd like to give them a chance. Let's see if something grows. The pickling cucumbers lost a couple of plants right at first because we had such a dry spell. But the plants that were left, they really bloomed, and they seem to be coming along well. And I put in a lot of bell peppers and a lot of jalapenos. Again, these are just things we eat a lot of. 4 melon plants, 1 watermelon, and 3 musk survived. I put in 3 of each. And then tomatillos, because tomatillos you can make this really great concentrated sauce from. And you can just throw a half pint of that in with, the meat of your choice and the bean of your choice, and you have this dish that's really great. You can put this dish on a tortilla. You can eat it in a bowl with garnish. So, in the garden, it's really demanding. A garden is really demanding. I mean, and that's not to mention that I had to till this 600 square foot plot out of grass that hadn't been tilled yet. A piece of earth that hadn't been tilled. And put up a rabbit fence that was a good secure rabbit fence with all of the little landscape. Now I can't remember. Well, it's like stakes, you know, a U-shaped stake, all of those. And around the bottom, get the perimeter just right, and stakes in and everything. So it was, you know, it was a lot. And at the beginning of June, we got a Rottweiler puppy. People who aren't familiar with Rottweiler puppies, they're great dogs, but they demand a lot of attention. They have tons of energy, and they are a handful. So between all of those things and the fact that I started the Patreon, it's so what's going on over at Patreon? I already had patrons that were simply just supporting me based on the work that I've done so far over the years. What I decided to do was to put up audios at Patreon and allow anyone at any level, I haven't even set a tier yet, to just start a pledge, and you'd have access to those audios. Now, I started out doing them once a week. But that was honestly too much. They were taking too much away from my other work, which I found to be more important. Though it's still important work. They're essentially, the audios I put up are readings with commentary. But what I did was I just reduced them now. They're going to be published every other week. And at this point in time, it's still open to whatever pledge you want to give. You can have access to them. Now, by the time I'm done reading the current book I'm reading, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls and Modern Scholarship, Solomon Zeitlin with commentary, which will be at least a few more readings. We're close towards the end of the book. After that, before I start the new book, I'm going to set a tier. It's just going to be a base tier of $10 a month for access to these. You can give more, that's fantastic. But that'll just be the base tier for this. If I start and I'm able to add things besides that, I may put in other tiers. I'm really not sure at this point in time. But, you know, just been a lot going on. So, with all that said, I got an email recently from somebody who, they were just curious on what my take was about where the other tribes, where the other families outside of Israel, because you have to think about it, Israel was one branch of many branches that made up Shem, right? So as per Genesis 10 and the chapters before it mentions, but Genesis 10 gives us essentially a genealogy, typically down to grandchildren, sometimes great-grandchildren, mostly just children, grandchildren, of Noah's three sons. Transliterated Ham, Shem, and Japheth. In the original, it would be really Kim, and Kim's a male name, Shim, and Yepat. So, the funny thing is, now after we get past Genesis 10, there's very few of those names that we see in Genesis 10, of all those genealogies branching out from those three sons. We mostly just see concentrated, besides for Israel, and Aram, which was another descendant of Shem. Mostly, we kind of see these descendants of Kim or Ham in the form of Canaanites, in the form of Mitzrim, not Egypt, in the form of the Pelishtim, or Philistines, and a few others. Mostly because, in part, Israel, once they developed in Mitzrayim, they were given this very large area of land wherein dwelt not only, because there were a number of people that lived in this very large expression of lands with an S they were given that weren't necessarily Canaanites. And they might not necessarily have been Hamites. We do know that Israel's close relatives lived among the in the outskirts in different regions, not to mention Aram up north. I guess in the Bible it's north. You know, we have Ammon and Moab across Yarden, which were the two sons of Lot's daughters. We have Adum, or Edom, which sprang from Oshu, or Esau, and his 3 wives. We have Omluk, who came from Edom. We have a lot of people. But yes, we mostly see heavy concentrations of what we would call Hamites, and probably a little smaller unless we start considering Aram, not Syria, Aram, and Ashur, not Assyria, Ashur. Those two both sprang from, according to the Bible, Shem. So the thing is, there's mostly, you're going to mostly hear figures in the realm of Christian identity or British Israelism that are going to talk at length about genealogies and peoples and who certain peoples are today, who they were, where they lived traditionally, today, more than anybody else. You might find some people in quasi-Protestant Christianity that'll go into that, but most people in Christianity at large, general Christianity, don't think that's really important, so they don't really spend much time on it. You might find some characters in this sort of seed line, like in the Nephilim kind of crowd, that might get into that. But again, they're not going to think that that stuff is as important as angels screwing women, human women, and having these hybrids, and everything has to do with hybrids anyways. And then very few Jews are going to get into that, because if Jews got too far into it, they would expose themselves as frauds. So they're not going to get that far into it either. But mostly this is going to come, if you want to look into that and you're dissatisfied with the mainstream idea, because the mainstream idea is that Noah had 3 sons. This is not only mainstream, it's also Talmudic. He had 3 sons. One, Shem, was the father of those who are Shemitic. So, brownish, Arabish sort of people, I guess. One, which would be Ham, black, and then, which a lot of them say would be part of his curse, to be black. Wow. That makes somebody feel good, huh? And then Japheth, which would typically, they would say is white. Now, how you're going to explain Orientals and other variations that are not like your Middle Easterner, Arab type, I don't know. But, they find all kinds of clever ways to try to explain that. they never explain why, if those 3 sons were of different races, how they came from the same father. Did they have 3 different mothers? And even if they had 3 different mothers that were of different races, they'd be half that race. And if they were the only people who were breeding with one another for hundreds of years, they would just homogenize and become one race. So it doesn't work. It's stupid. It's illogical. So a lot of people, they figure that out right away. This is really illogical. This is really stupid. This doesn't reflect reality. So then what happens is they find themselves in the clutches of British Israelism or different variations of Christian identity. Now, it used to be Christian identity decades ago was a little more liberal in the sense of more Christian than identity. I would say, guys like Pete Peters or Jack Moore were maybe more emphasis on the Christian than the identity. But these days, it seems like most of the people involved with this in this area are very much identity. And I'm not saying Christian's not in there, but maybe a little bit more focused on the identity part. So you'll probably get a lot of information from these people. Many of them, the leading figures still around and working today, have either written books or published books with their names on it, or have extensive websites and blogs and articles, which to me, it actually boggles the mind how they could produce so much so quickly under the circumstances, because I'm no slouch. And I work tirelessly in the areas that I work within. And there's no way I can hope to produce some of the stuff I've seen produced by some of these characters who are claiming to be one single guy just plugging away at this stuff. Now, you could in part explain some of this because most of them, all of them, are just repeating shit over and over, just repeating the same old garbage. So in part, you could account for that. But new information, we're talking about raw data research, examining raw data and coming to conclusions based on those examinations, and then attempting to prove those conclusions. That is majorly time consuming. Majorly time consuming. So I'm not sure how these guys really produce the level of volume that they produce. But here's the thing. So there's been time for, forget British Israelism, all of that stuff like Worldwide Church of God and everything's been fragmented so much. And I mean, people smelled a rat in British Israelism quite some time ago. Then that really died out, and Christian identity took its place in a big, strong way. Christian identity appeals to a number of questions that people have that other sects of Christianity or people who are dealing with the Bible don't address. And they tend to be oftentimes very realistic and seemingly practical items that Christian identity is addressing that the others are not. Unfortunately, and this is why I got away from Christian identity, there's so much that they espouse that I find to be both biblically inaccurate and not provable even in the world, because we have to look at what can we prove in the world. If we find something in the Bible, like, if we found some kind of claim in the Bible that said something like, I don't know, trolls grow from Norwegian maples. Okay? We really need to check our world. We really need to check our reality and see if that's something that seems possible or that anyone has noticed happening. And if we can't find that, then we need to think, okay, there's probably some something wrong with the information as we're being given here. That's why that's sort of the two of the threefold. The third one is looking into all of these distorted languages amongst certain populations. Not all white people, no, but certain populations that have lived in Europe and America who have been mostly targeted populations. That's who I'm looking at because that bears the most fruit. All right, so what happened? If Noah had 3 sons, and in Genesis chapter 10, we see this huge amount, well, pretty large amount, of just sons, and in some cases grandsons of these 3 sons, being listed. It seems like they're listed for a reason. A number of them pop up here and there in the prophets and in the law as we go forward. Like, hey, there must be a reason for this. I mean, did they all last? Did they not? What happened to them? Are they in the world today? Could we identify them by geography or by something? Ethnology, language, what's the deal? Which is, it's a good question, and it's something that should be addressed. My problem is that I know that those people that are addressing this, mostly Christian identity people, they simply don't have the materials and resources to adequately address this. And, I could just be, I'm not going to say fair. I could give them the benefit of the doubt and simply say, I think they're being misled by thinking the resources that are currently available are in any way, shape, or form trustworthy. So that's fine. I'll just treat it like that. We'll just say that these folks are not actually enemy combatants, full-on soldiers for the people who are controlling all of the resources in the world and keeping certain other people stupid and unhealthy, etc. We'll treat them like they're incorrect. They've made some errors. That's fine. My point is, there's no way they could hope to try to teach anybody about any of these other people types and where they might be, what might have happened to them, or anything, based on the materials that they currently have or the systems, the techniques that they're using for reading and interpreting the Bible. You put the whole package together, and they should not be commenting on this at all, other than a lot of, I'm not quite sure's. But they don't do that. They actually talk about these things like they're very sure. They're quite positive. And I'm going to address why they're absolutely wrong and why they should not, under any circumstances, be trusted. They should be taken seriously, but not trusted. They should be taken seriously as serious adversaries. So let's see if I can go through what they are teaching, and they themselves are full of shit. The thing is, we do have to start at the beginning. It's a good place to start, before Genesis 10. Now, I covered some of this in some earlier The Obery Hours studies, when I took a look at the word Adame, which has been, it's like 100, 200 times translated as earth and ground, though everything about the glyphs in that word speak to it being in direct relation with the term Adam. So, if you want to go right back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, I guess you cannot believe what I do, which is that in Genesis chapter 1, there's clearly a narrative saying that there was this creation of Adam, and then in chapter 2, it begins after the verses about, Alium rested and all that, and then you pick up, and it says, not that there wasn't any rain, it says that there was no Adam to Obed, well, the rain part, that's the verse before, but the verse after, there was no Adam to Obed serve or manage the Adamah. So, there was an Adam taken from, and they changed the syntax in that verse. I'm talking about Genesis chapter 2. I don't feel like going through it line by line. You can find this. It's there. It's clearly there in the Obri or the Hebrew. And you'll know what verse I'm referring to based on my context. They had to change the syntax because the actual Obri says that Yahweh Elohim took from the Opar, the Adamah. Now, most of the time, Opar gets translated as dust, but its root, par, mostly has to do with seeds of people, of plants, of anything. It says that he took of the Opar of the Adamah, and he didn't create a new person, but that he did something to this being, making him different. And he was then, based on the context, expected to be in a, let's just say, in a better managerial role. So let's just assume, and we could assume that the Adam being talked about, anybody out there could assume that he was of any other race than the one I'm going to say, and I've said before, and I believe if you just look at the world, who's running it? The characteristics of peoples. It's abundantly apparent that this Adam that we see in Genesis 2 and going forward was what we call white people. Now, just because we believe that this one starting in Genesis 2 was white, or if you want to believe they were black or anything else, that doesn't prove that there wasn't whites or whatever race or kind this Adam from Genesis chapter 2 existed before this. That component's important as we go forward. Now, it's not the end-all be-all of all the information, but we have to consider all the information that we can see in the Bible. And then we have to consider the world around us, how it works, our natures, peoples, things like that. The narrative in Genesis 2 seems to, including the narrative in Genesis 1. The narrative in Genesis 1, they had to change two terms in the verse on the creation of Adam to make it seem like male and female. It's Zakar and Nakwabe. They changed those terms to male and female. When if you look at those two words overall in the context of all of their other occurrences and their cognates, one of them, the Zakar, seems to refer to them being created with memories. The second seems to be indicating them being sorted, as in ethnologically, perhaps, or simply geographically. I'm not 100% sure, but I am telling you that whoever is behind the Masorah and the translations stemming from the Masorah radically changed those words. What do I mean? What I mean is, it's highly likely that man and all races of were created in a way that they basically hit the ground running. In fact, they may have all been created in their respective environments and cultures with buildings already built, having knowledge of various things depending on their race and their culture and the way that Yahweh created them to exist, which is not a bad thing. It's not a lesser thing if some exist in huts and others exist in skyscrapers. This is not about better or worse. This is about one kind of man and another kind of man. And when those people developed the Masorah in order to hide what the Bible was really saying, they take all of that information away from us because they need us confused. They need us lost so they can reintroduce different cultures, basically no culture. Because people today, specifically white people, other people that aren't white, they get to hold on to cultures a lot more, even though I believe they've been lied to about their actual culture, I'm afraid to say. They've taken away that sort of knowledge. So imagine that. And you don't have to imagine because there's a certain amount of evidence right in the text that we had kinds of man created with memories, with knowledge of their world, their culture, and based on their kind, able to hit the ground running. Then, after a time, it was pretty clear that, and I don't want this to come off as like a mistake, but if we follow Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, we see that one kind of man, and this is also apparent in the calling of Abraham, right? We see something similar there. We see one of the Adam taken, something different or special imparted on him, possibly an actual taking of his genetic material and making a woman so that he would spring forth another race from there. And that's where we get the genealogy starting in Genesis chapter 5 forward. So just because we see the things that we see in those first few chapters, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Adam and the Eve that we see from Genesis 2 forward were the only people of that particular race. There could have been plenty of people before that, and there is no time given as far as where we see the wrap-up of what we believe is the Genesis 1 creation story that ends on like verse 4 in Genesis 2 to verse 5. We don't know what kind of period of time there was between those two. A couple hundred years would certainly prove a lot regarding the behaviors and the results of behaviors of all these peoples in order to justify perhaps what we see from Genesis 2:5 forward. What I mean to say is, just because we see a genealogy from that Adam and Eve, starting at Genesis 5 forward, and then continued in Genesis 10 with a lot more detail of the three sons of Noah, doesn't mean they were the only, if we're going to believe they were white people, that they were the only ones. And we know that other people, like the Kenites, which are the Quinim from Cain, it would appear, Maybe, because I got some issues with Genesis 3 and 4. we do see at least them after what we believe is a flood. So there's that. There's things like, for instance, the Kashadim. What is translated, it's not transliterated, it's translated as Chaldeans. We don't see them. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't come from the genealogy of those three sons of Noah. That means we don't see them, though. We don't see them. We don't see Paris. We see Madi, which are called the Medes. We don't see Paris, which is called the Persians. We don't see them in there. Does that mean that they were possibly made up of peoples who existed prior to the Adam that we see in Genesis 2? Maybe. Does that mean that they were possibly sons, like grandsons, great-grandsons of the three sons of Noah? Maybe. Maybe. But we have every reason in the world to believe that the people that we are seeing, as far as nations, empires, civilizations, are all of a particular race of people, and most stemming from, according to the Bible, these three sons of Noah. For the most part. Like I said, we really don't have proof of like the Kasdim or Chaldeans and the Parasim or Persians. So we're going to have to kind of put that in its own corner. Now, most people, they're not going to tell you this. They're probably going to try to say that they're from this, that, and the other. In fact, most of these Christian identity people, they would probably tell you things like, he'd probably try to say, well, a lot of these people, maybe the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, they were breeding with non-white people, and that's why they looked Arabic or whatever. I mean, one of the most absurd things they could do to prove how they're either adversarial in everything they do, or just... What can I say without being insulting? Or they're just stupid. Is by them constantly reaffirming that all of this happened in the Middle East, in the fucking Levant. That's just stupid. That doesn't even consider the size, the fucking size of the place, for one thing. We can squash that pretty easily. Besides the fact that when Israel left Mitzrayim and they were told that they were going to a good and a large land, we know that, for one thing, the delta area of Egypt is not only bigger by far, just the delta, bigger by far than the bounds of Palestine, which the bounds of Palestine today would have to be pretty close. Actually, they're bigger today. They're bigger today. Look at some of the older maps from like late 1800s, early 1900s. They started out and it was smaller. They're told in the wilderness they're going to a good and a large land. How does anyone describe Palestine as good and large when you just came from the Nile Delta, which is far larger, far wider, and far more lush? It's the same basic environment. You can't grow cattle without air-conditioned barns. And there's only a few other ruminants that can manage in that heat. And then there's grass they need. They need grass. Then there's the whole idea of desertification. Desertification. Well, here's the problem. You can make the place as green as you want. You can imagine that springs abounded there. And somehow or another, all of the rock and sand that we see today was actually good, rich topsoil. I don't know what happened to that, but you can imagine if you want, even though there's no proof whatsoever that desertification has ever happened anywhere. It's all conjecture. All of it. There's no good, hard evidence of it. Consider Israel alone, people genetically related to Jacob Israel. Israel alone, when they came out of Mitzrayim and came to Canaan, right before they come into Canaan, because they lost a lot of people, their growth rate, like a people's exponential growth rate, was radically retarded in the wilderness because they lost so many people, or they would have grown significantly in those 40 years. So they had close to the same amount before they came into Canaan that they did when they left Mitzrayim. They had a few million. That's genetically related to Jacob. That doesn't count what they call the mixed multitude, which were a lot of people. A lot of people. And some of them were lost too, but a lot of them remained and came into Canaan also. But let's just say those people related to Jacob Israel were about 2 to 3 million based on common demographics and how many men we see counted. 600,000. Would have to be. That wasn't just men. That was able-bodied men. Strong young men who could walk, not kids. So 20, probably about 20 to 60, basically. 2 to 3 million. Yahweh tells Israel in the book of Deuteronomy that there are 7 nations greater and mightier than them in Canaan, which has to be Palestine if they want to keep their stupid Levantine model. How many is that? That's at least 21 million plus Israel, and that doesn't count the Philistines, who they call the Avim also, who still live there, the Kerethites, the Pelethites. How about Edom, Moab, Ammon, Hamat, Aram, who were all supposed to live around their borders, Omlik. The Kenites, they say. The Midianites, which I've covered, but they still want to treat them like they were an actual people. There were Midianites all over the place because it was Midian. It was the Midlands. People who lived in the Midlands. Lots of people that we're not even counting. We're not even counting. We're not even counting like these various people that are supposed to be giants, like the Onakim and the Raphaim, and we're not even counting those. We're just counting 7 Canaanite nations, greater and mightier. That's at least 21 million, plus Israel's 3 million. Now listen, they claim to have around 8 to 12 million people over there right now, which is fucking crazy. And the only way they can do that is because powers in the West have made absolutely sure that they could concentrate a lot of people, mostly in a few urban centers like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Hebron, and a few other places. That's where the main concentration is. And in order to do that, they set up all kinds of fresh water pipelines, water filtration systems, because they have to filter it, whether it's coming from the Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. That's brackish water. They got to filter all that out and treat it, and then pump it uphill to Jerusalem. 4-foot pipelines they had to put in. Now it's easier at places like Tel Aviv and Akko and all that. They're right on the sea, and they can do all their water treatment right there and get it to those places easier, which is probably why they made the capital Tel Aviv. It's far easier to supply the people there than in what they call Jerusalem, because it's so remote. It's in these rocky, shitty hills. It was difficult to build all the highways through all of that. And then they got to pipe water up to there. They've got to import food and all kinds of other things there just to try to make this place look like it's something. When before they did all this, it was a place where very few Arab Bedouin people lived, grew very little vegetation because all the water's brackish, all of it. Anything that comes up in springs is brackish. All of it. And it's a matter of room. It's a matter of room. The place is about 75 miles at its greatest width. Up north, 25 miles or so. I'm not kidding. It's about 200, 250 if you want to consider to that little point at the north of the Gulf of Aqaba. 250 miles. Mostly all desert. Nothing there. Nothing there. And you're telling me that when they came in, there was at least, and this is base, at least 21 million Canaanites. Doesn't count Philistines. It doesn't count the people of Hamath that live to the north. It doesn't count, of course, the Omni, the Moabi, the people I went through, Edom. There's other tribes like the Gerizim and others I can't even think of right now. Doesn't even count them. That's why these people, they're either enemies, they're adversaries, or they're idiots. Because it didn't and couldn't happen there. And then think about the fact that Israel let most of the people who already live there stay at tribute. Stay. And Israel enjoyed so much growth as they went forward in a nation. They lost people. They had defeats. They were oppressed. But oftentimes when they were oppressed by others, it's not like they were oppressed by others who were committing genocide on them. They were oppressed by others who took over their main centers of government or military and dictated that they would supply them, because that's the way shit works. So they were still growing in population from that point forward, and they let a lot of the Canaanites stay. The Philistines weren't displaced. A lot of other people weren't displaced. That was one of the big problems. And you're telling me all that fucking happened in Palestine? You're out of your fucking mind. You're out of your mind. It can't happen. You haven't thought it through. People who won't even entertain this, they're either stupid or they're adversaries. Because part of their job is to keep your eyes on a place that is not the place where all of these events occurred. They don't want you to look around you if you live in North America. They don't want you to look around you. They don't want you to consider reality. Reality. And reality tells us none of these things could have happened in the Levant or the Middle East. I had to get that out of the way. I'm already an hour into this. This isn't very brief. But look, let's talk about simply the resources being used and why nobody out there can talk about this in any way that's trustworthy at all. They use as their sources two extraordinarily untrustworthy things. One of them is the Bible, either the New Testament, and everybody knows how I feel about the New Testament. Think about the New Testament at this point in time. Those who would think to teach geography, ethnology, the history of peoples, who use the New Testament along with the Old Testament, they either don't know or simply know and aren't admitting that the New Testament geography, ethnology, and absolutely storyline narrative does not agree with the Old Testament. The New Testament, all of those features of the New Testament, every kind of feature you can imagine of the New Testament, agrees with Josephus. It agrees with the Apocrypha, the Maccabees, extremely Jewish sorts of books like Talmudic. And we don't even have to call it that, but they're certainly not in agreement with the Old Testament narrative. The New Testament agrees with Josephus, Jerome, Eusebius, that sort of thing. Not the Old Testament. Geography, definitely not the Old Testament. And it doesn't even begin to really discuss much of anything that has to do with the Old Testament and the peoples in the New. And they introduce this idea of Rome in the New Testament. They try to address this idea of Greece, which is not Greece. It's Yun, that sometimes gets transliterated as Javan. The New Testament is loaded because it's Koine Greek, which we don't know how bastardized Koine Greek is from whatever the language they call Greek started out being, which was probably more like Latin as we know it, because it probably came from a very similar people. It was just altered over time. For what reason, I don't know. But there's far, far, far too much terminology that doesn't agree. There's far too much grammar and the way that the language is actually implemented in Koine Greek that doesn't agree, even with Masoretic Hebrew, which is in far more agreement with Koine Greek than when you take away the Masorah. But even if those factors didn't exist, just the themes, just the material, doesn't agree. It's not a continuation of the Old Testament. That's why they claim there was this huge 400 years interim between what they claim was the last book of the Old Testament and the book of Matthew. So, besides for the problems with using the New Testament in tandem with the Old Testament, you've got the fact that they're all using Old Testament materials and resources based on the Masorah. I've proven a number of times how unreliable the Masorah is. Radically unreliable. That's what they use. If they do word studies, they use materials, reference materials based on the Masorah. Period. They're not trying to clarify. They're not digging beneath the surface and looking at root families and then looking at the languages of the poor peoples of white countries in the last couple hundred years, the Celts. And I have to say Germanic because so many Celts lived in Germany up until probably the last couple of world wars, which is when most of them were likely eradicated from certain parts of Europe. Anglo-Saxons, very similar to Celtic, which it's all similar to Obry. They're not looking into that. They're not trying to determine what these words might be based on evidence from the Bible in determining a root family and those languages. They're just using Masoretically derived reference materials. That's bad. That's not good. That's not okay. They're just vomiting up the same vomit that those reference materials, which were produced by very untrustworthy people, oftentimes mysterious, unknown people, like the Masorah. We don't know who the Masoretes were. But if we want to take their narrative, Christian Identity's narrative, they were Jews. So what the hell's wrong with these people? If they say it's the Jews and the Jews are running everything, them bad old Jews, what the hell's wrong with you? Why are you using their materials? Why are you using the Masorah? Are you not thinking that one through? So that's problem one. Problem two is they're using establishment, quote unquote, historical sources. They're using establishment, quote unquote, historical sources. Sources that read like fairy tales, because they are fairy tales. Take the time to read them. Take the time to read portions of Josephus. Read his Antiquities of the Jews. It's fucking ridiculous. It reads like a fairy tale because it's a fairy tale. Read Herodotus, Pliny, Eusebius, Jerome. These are all derivative, by the way, folks. A lot of them are really just derivative from Josephus, and a lot of others are derivative from Herodotus. There's very few that claim to be original, and everything else is derivative from that. Anything Gibbon produced is derivative from Livy, and a lot of Livy's material is derivative from others. Much of it goes back to Josephus and a few other core works. Establishment approved works that read like cartoons. Some of the reasons that, and you'll see this, if you can just get the English translations of these like pillars of establishment history, because they're going to be translated from Koine Greek, from Latin, sometimes from German, maybe sometimes from French, Latin languages for the most part, or maybe Greek languages, maybe. Even the English translations of these establishment-approved history works, which is where these Christian Identity and whoever else thinks to try to teach on who people are today from the Bible and all that, they read so ridiculously. Now this is a caricature I'm about to give you, but you will see for yourself if you go and you read these things. They'll say something like, some great king at some place in some time, and they may give him some kind of a name or a reference to maybe something biblical, heard that there was a great city in the east, a great city laden with gold and jewels, whose king was so wealthy, and so on and so forth. So he decided he wanted that city, so he built his army by promising every knight who enlisted would get 10 big-tittied virgins out of the deal, and his own truckload of gold. They read like fucking fairy tales. There's no reason why any thoughtful, rational person would believe these as history. So look, it's like a minute 12 into this brief. There's not a chance I'm going to go into where I think these tribes from the Bible, let's say mostly just from Genesis 10, Noah's 3 sons forward, went. But there's all kinds of reasons why a tribe or a defined expression of a people could disappear. It could be that they really disappeared. It could be that they've just disappeared from our knowledge. Keep in mind, remember, Israel and Judah, they're only a fragment, a portion of a greater race. People who teach things like all of any given race, and I don't care what race. I don't care if we're talking about people who teach Black Hebrew Israelites. I don't care if we're talking about Jews. I don't care if we're talking about Christian identity. If they teach that all of a certain race are the people of the Bible, the Israel, Judah of the Bible, they're either stupid or they're adversarial. Think about it. Israel was a son of 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 Noah. All of his children would have had to have been racially homogeneous. All of their descendants racially homogeneous. They were a portion of a larger group. And because there were a certain amount of laws concerning them breeding within what was defined as a nation by the time they came out of Mitzrayim, they would have been a people of certain definite characteristics in their behavior, the way they thought, the way they looked. I'm sure that the secret ethnologists of today have ways of measuring certain things about a newborn baby, or maybe one that's a few months old, and determining which, not race, which ethnicity that baby is, or at least is most likely from. Now, at that, I wanted to talk about, which I will in a subsequent briefs, this whole idea of coming to America, Europe coming to America. The idea that, first off, America is the old world, as well as a number of other places, really, seem to have structures, infrastructures, and histories of being quite old. America does as well. Old world, very well developed, old world. And the idea that I espoused for a long time too, because I have to come to understand things step by step by step by step, just like anyone else would. That's why I didn't appear on the scene with a fully formed narrative like so many do, who are adversaries. I have to develop this understanding based on all of the shitty information I've been taught since I was a little kid, getting rid of that and developing better information based on the resources I use. A lot of Israelites and Judahites that are currently in America likely never left. A lot of the people in America today, their descendants likely never left. You know how the 1800s is a huge black hole of everything. You can't trust anything that was said to have been done in the 1800s or the 1700s, especially the 1800s. And one of those things that was said to have happened in the 1800s is the biggest migration of people ever in world history from Europe to the Americas. And the thing is, there's not any really good reasons for that happening, and not in those numbers. My contention is many of us who live here today, who may have ancestors who say they came over from Europe, maybe they were told that. Maybe they were told that. Because there was so much upheaval, so much moving around, and so much, especially in World War I and II, people being programmed with the idea that you don't tell other people about yourself, about what you do, about your history, about where you're from, things like that. That generation, before my parents' generation, my parents were born during World War II, right around that time. The generation before that were so tight-lipped, it would be hard for even the children and grandchildren of those people to really know where they came from. And they were probably told. And many of them might have been orphaned or moved around and simply told, well, your ancestors came over on the boat, your parents who you were your parents unfortunately died of the plague, and they came over on the boat from Germany, from Ireland, from wherever, England, name a European country. I'm more likely to believe that a lot of white people of different ethnicities already lived in America, that great migration didn't happen. There was some migration, I'm sure, but not like we've been told. Now that factors into this whole mess that we're looking at, but I'm not going to go into that because I'm almost at 1 hour, 20 minutes. So that kind of is a primer for why just about anything that anybody's teaching about peoples can't possibly be taken seriously. It can't possibly be taken seriously because of the resources they're using. And they're not telling you, well, these resources are probably not very trustworthy. If they were only using the Bible, and I'll give them the New Testament, but the problem is if you give them the New Testament, then you've got to put this over in the Middle East, and that doesn't work. But whatever. If they were just using the Bible and good observations of reality today, they would never teach and espouse the things they teach and espouse. So that is a monumental problem. And I'll tell you what I'll do. I will pick up again on this topic in my next briefs. But the first part of it had to be at least breaking into this and at least explaining why virtually all the information that you might get from these people who think to teach a damn thing about ethnicities, peoples, where they were, where they are, so on and so forth, cannot be trusted. Cannot be trusted. So with that, I will wrap. And again, the email, don't forget that if you want a monthly mailer. If you'd like to support what I'm doing and you get a little something extra out of it, and every other week reading with commentary on good subjects, go to my Patreon. That link is also in the description. And make a pledge, because it really does help. Every small pledge, every large pledge really does help me to continue doing what I'm doing. And I appreciate it. I very much appreciate those people who help, who give donations, not just through Patreon. People give donations through other things, other methods, Venmo, PayPal, you know, the typical. But it all helps. It's all radically appreciated, and it's all going towards good, honest work being done in areas that are not just radically significant to us, but as this world continues to change in a direction that is not friendly to you or I, it is going to be far, 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 the work I'm doing far, far more appropriate and significant to our children. So that right there is a great reason to help and support the work that I do. And with that, I thank you for joining me for this briefs. I will see you pretty soon with the next one. Take care.